Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT. Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Road pricing is not a new concept. We can see examples of it in our towns, cities and road networks already. In the UK, London's congestion charge zone is the most notable, and people may also be familiar with toll roads in countries around the world. However, to date, road pricing has proved to be politically unacceptable, but a new report by the House of Commons Transport Committee signals that political appetite is maybe starting to come around, or at least that it might have to be. With electric vehicle ownership on the rise, income through fuel duty will ultimately decrease, leaving a large deficit in the Treasury. Discussing road pricing today, I'm joined by Alistair Hunter, who's the Highways Business Leader for Arup in their UKIMEA region, and Patrick Andison, who's their Senior Economics Consultant at Arup also. Alistair recently gave evidence as a witness to the Transport Committee's inquiry on road pricing. With his contribution helping form part of the committee's final report was released at the start of February this year. Patrick in his role has amassed a concentration of experience in the future of urban mobility and road pricing, as well as the economic implications of major infrastructure programmes. I'm your host, Kel Fairbairn, and welcome to the CIHT podcast. Great to have you both here today. I suppose I'd just like to start off by asking, you could just sort of give a brief outline on what road pricing is.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with that, Kyle. So road pricing in its simplest form can be dated back many centuries to the old turnpike roads, and in simple terms, where a road user will pay some sort of charge or levy to use that piece of infrastructure, and generally it's related to, or is often related to, the cost of its either its maintenance or its construction, its original construction value. So that's it in a nutshell, Kyle. It's got a modern context, of course, which maybe we'll come on to as we go through this discussion.
I've noticed, especially in sort of Arup's work and outputs, term mobility pricing gets used quite a lot. And is there anything different what makes up that term in comparison to road pricing? If so, like how?
Absolutely. I'll kick off, Carl, then maybe Patrick will come on. I mean, the whole concept around mobility pricing, and it's come into, the other term that's being used at the moment is the sort of alternative road tax, particularly in light of the EVs and the declining revenue coming from, or the predicted declining revenue coming from fuel duty and VED. The whole concept around mobility pricing is that the users are generally willing to pay something for the usage of the network, any network. And so it's got a different context and a much wider context. So a lot of the uses of mobility pricing, a lot of the funding and the revenue raised goes back into the transport system, and it may be used for mass transit systems, it may be used for other public transport options that need some sort of revenue to be viable. And so the mobility pricing is a much more collective term than road user charging, and fundamentally has a different meaning for the road user because it gives them more options. Patrick, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I just add, I think going back to how you introed this podcast, Kyle, and the kind of reference to road pricing being something that's kind of politically challenging or difficult, and to date has proved that way. I would argue that to date, as Alistair's kind of alluded to, we have a long history of pricing roads. We've just done it in a variety of different ways. And where we're coming to in this conversation at the moment is that our current form of pricing roads, which has been primarily through taxation of fuel, is coming to its kind of natural course of end in terms of its viability because of the way that cars are evolving and electrification of our road network. So that means we have to start thinking about what comes next. And I think the term mobility pricing allows us to start thinking about what comes next in a much more integrated way as we reflect that the kind of modes of transport are becoming more integrated all the time, and therefore we need to start thinking about the way we price things in a more integrated way as well.
So is it kind of more looking at it from a holistic view across a broad range of transport and modes? And if that's the case, how does that sort of work? How do you sort of start to implement a system if you're going to be encompassing modes that are not necessarily like the motor vehicle into a pricing strategy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of talk about hypothecation of revenue, which is a sort of fancy word for saying that you collect the revenue from the vehicle user in some shape or form, and you plow it back into the transport system. So there's a fundamental question here about when it comes to road pricing, mobility pricing, around fairness. How do you make it so that it's not just another tax that predominantly favours the wealthy, but with a greater willingness to pay? There are well proven models that allow that revenue to be split up either geographically, if you look at the continent, and kind of dispersed to various countries where freight travels across from Russia all the way to France, if you like. Or there's ways where in many other towns and cities where the actual a chunk of the revenue is then used to supplement public transport. So it's a fairly well proven sort of route of how you then take the revenue and use it for a variety of means.
Do you think what would be collected through a mobility pricing strategy would then go back into sort of fund infrastructure investment? Do you think that is something that is achievable almost, like politically? Because especially with things like fuel duty and such, it doesn't go wholly back into infrastructure investment. It obviously goes to other parts. So do you think that you're able, just with a new sort of like strategy there, mobility pricing, do you think that's achievable kind of now, where previously it might not?
I think it's certainly an opportunity. You're dead right about the circa 35 billion that comes from a combination of fuel duty and VED. At the moment, around 80% of that just goes straight back into the general coffers to pay for education or social care or the social bill in one way or another. So you're absolutely right. At the moment, the majority of, if you like, road tax is used for other reasons. So there is an opportunity, but it's got to be to use more of that funding raised for transport. But of course, it's also, from a governmental perspective, any government has to balance it against other competing needs. And that will be one of the challenges that any country that's looking to go down this route faces. It's about balancing those competing sort of needs of the public purse, really.
The other important thing that I would add here is that pricing isn't just about funding additional infrastructure and new infrastructure in the transport space, but also trying to make sure we get the most out of our existing infrastructure. So looking at how are we using pricing across modes, and roads is just one kind of example of that, to make sure that we're trying to get the most out of our infrastructure assets. So thinking about, for example, somebody that's taking a typical journey from London to Birmingham, is there reasonable, frequent alternatives for them to do that journey by rail, by other means that are perhaps more efficient than driving a private vehicle? The ability to use pricing to help shape some of that demand in the future so that we get the most out of our existing infrastructure is a key angle as well to the kind of mobility pricing approach to thinking. It's about intelligence as much as it is about hypothecation of revenue.
Kind of coming just onto that, Cal, one thing is clear about mobility pricing systems that work, that have been proven to be a success, is you do have to have there's got to be a bit of carrot to go along with the stick. So there has to be good, viable alternatives. You can't simply go along a road of pricing people off the road. It simply doesn't work. It doesn't work for people, doesn't work for the economy, doesn't work for the way we live. So there has to be a good alternatives in the zones of the areas where you're suffering from an awful lot of congestion. You want to do something around demand management. It's not working for anybody. So you introduce some sort of disincentive through a pricing mechanism, but you can't simply price people out. You have to give them a more efficient way of moving into, say, a city or wherever they want to get to. So it is the mobility pricing systems that have been successful throughout the world have always been mated with a alternative mass transit type solution in where it's appropriate to do so. So that's a key facet really of what makes a successful mobility pricing scheme.
Can you give an example where that success has happened, where you've got that carrot in the stick?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few examples. They are generally cities, but if you looked at a city like Stockholm or a country like Singapore, in Singapore you have a sort of one mobility card, and you go from road to rail to bus. And you just use your one mobility card, if you like. And so that's a sort of entirely integrated system whereby the whole transport system is linked. There's, if you like, a commonality of payment systems there. It does give the benefit. It is easier to do in clearly dense urban populations where you've got the high usership. And so you need sort of, with the mobility pricing, you kind of need to look at quite carefully the sort of demographics, the spatial qualities of where the scheme applies for what will be applicable and what will work in that location.
Just to kind of add to Alistair's important kind of point point there about the kind of carrot and the stick and all of that, and thinking from a kind of systems approach to how we think about these challenges. I mean, it depends on also what kind of outcomes you're trying to achieve with mobility pricing, and then what's the appropriate carrot to balance that out. So to Alistair's point there about kind of making sure people have realistic alternatives in terms of if you're trying to create mode shift and think about kind of trying to get people onto public transport or more efficient ways of traveling. Equally, if you're trying to use mobility pricing, as has been done in London, for example, to target air quality and cleaning the air and lowering the carbon emissions of vehicles, you also have to provide incentives around things like scrappage schemes and other ways to try and encourage people to uptake the electric vehicles that mean that they won't be facing those charges. So it's all about providing people ways around that charge, as well as kind of equal measures to enforce it as necessary.
So, because coming out of that, the Transport Committee's report, I mean, the main headline was "Act Now to Fill This Hole in the Treasury." So do you think, coming off of those comments there, that if you're to implement such a strategy, then you should be angling it not just at filling this fiscal black hole, it should be more about like a health agenda or something to do with net zero? Should you be pitching it more at that as the driver of it?
I think absolutely, Kyle. I mean, if it's pure revenue generation that the Treasury needs to achieve, there are other ways that Treasury no doubt will be considering in terms of how to achieve that, and arguably more efficient ways from a sort of tax administration perspective. You could simply increase the rate of basic tax or any of the myriad of other sort of taxation options that the Treasury have, the levers they can pull relatively easily. So the mobility pricing argument only starts to make sense when you tie it to the wider policy objectives and benefits and outcomes that you can achieve. There are other ways, arguably a lot simpler than mobility pricing is a pure taxation. So it only makes sense really when you're looking at those wider policy objectives. We've got a situation in the UK where we're a fairly densely populated island, particularly in the south of the country and around our cities, and the congestion in those areas is generally, regardless of which model you look at, is generally predicted to get worse, to deteriorate to quite some extent if you look through to, say, the 2050 timeline. Fairly serious sort of congestion issues, which affects productivity, economic health, social health, which we need to sort of start tackling and looking at. And that's really where mobility pricing is an option for policymakers.
But I would argue the real challenge, and from an economics point of view, in some ways the really exciting part of this too, is that it is the true tightrope to walk that one has to do when balancing the kind of almost naturally competing aims between revenue generation and achieving some of those transport outcomes. So very simply, if you could imagine a scheme that's charging heavy polluting vehicles, by achieving the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve through that, which is to clean up the vehicle fleet, you're eating away at the revenue generation potential of that scheme. So there is a real balancing act that's required in terms of how do you get the policy right in order to achieve both some transport outcomes that you're seeking to achieve, as well as to generate revenue if that's a primary aim of Treasury through this exercise. And I think that's where it gets quite interesting. And that's where you also have to start thinking about how are you implementing a system and a set of technologies that can actually be flexible and change over time as some of those policy drivers and kind of key transport outcomes that you're seeking to change.
Yeah, and those policy outcomes that Patrick was alluding to there can change over time. Right. So a few years ago, the air quality first emerged as a real health issue, and the clean air zones have followed at various kind of rates. And then a little bit later, probably the kind of carbon agenda really took grip as arguably overtaking the air quality sort of as a prime concern that we're trying to address. And hopefully with decarbonisation of a fleet, then in future years that won't be so much of an issue. But then by if you look at the population growth and the areas of development that are occurring at the moment, where the new housing is, congestion will still get worse and worse, which does. So maybe that will come back to being the number one in 10, 20 years time when we've got the other things under control. So there's a policy framework there that you have to realise changes over time, and any mobility pricing scheme needs the flexibility to be able to tackle each of the issues of the day, if you like.
What does that flexibility look like then? Maybe in regard to the way you implement a mobility pricing strategy or a road pricing strategy, like the technology. What does that look like, and how do you factor in the change into that so you're not left with this web of disjointed systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think the framework, I don't think it's a technological issue. It's much more a policy-led set of choices that you have. Countries may choose to levy the taxes according to the size of a vehicle, the polluting emissions associated with it, or the time of day, or the spatial when and where do you travel. So there's a whole host of kind of levers you can pull for getting that flexibility. The technology angle at the moment, you refer to the kind of patchwork quilt that we've got at the moment. You're absolutely right. There would have to be, on a national pricing scheme, it's likely there'd have to be some serious integration of those systems. We had a few years ago that there were actually 31 clean air zones that were kind of recognised, cities, urban areas. And now some of those have dropped by the wayside, and some are at various states of completion. Some have been delayed. There's a whole tranche of projects there in the pipeline, various stages. But it does kind of paint the picture that at some point there's going to need to be some sort of technological integration at a sort of platform level, and that central to that, the customer interface, the usability from a customer perspective, that's going to be the key thing, right? And we're probably at the start of that journey. There's lots of different technologies out there that can ostensibly do a same or similar job. We are at a stage in the UK where we've got a lot of relatively small, discrete systems. Some of them have commonality in terms of elements of the back office, some of the clean air zones in particular. But then on top of that, you've got various river crossings, you've got schemes around that control surface access around airports, and so on and so forth. So we are at a stage where we've got a sort of divergence of schemes at the moment, and there is the opportunity to start to bring them into a point so that they start to converge again. And that's as I say, that I think from a kind of customer perspective, unless we do that, it's going to become incredibly complicated to navigate around the country.
Would you say there's room to innovate there? Is it kind of in the urban space where you're looking for that biggest innovation or the opportunities to innovate? Is it the kind of the strategic road networks where you'd maybe use from another country that's kind of already been tried and tested?
Yeah, there is huge opportunity to innovate for the UK. A lot of the kind of conceptually and practically, I suppose, speaking, it is easier to start with the kind of strategic road networks of any country because they're kind of more defined, the cleaner cut, if you like, they're easier to apply. But if you're looking at a national system and bearing in mind that the majority of our journeys are actually done off the strategic road network on the local roads and around the cities are where the majority of the mileage occurs. So from a sort of revenue collection perspective, it's probably fairly sensible to think that to answer that key question, the whole network has to be charged in some way or another, or the system has to be able to apply to the whole network. And so there's huge sort of opportunity for the UK to be a leader in some sort of satellite-based system, say, but which has a flexibility which is really sensible for the customer user, and this sort of location, the specific location that meets the sort of economic agenda of the sub-regions.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognize that cities have kind of long been leaders in this space. I mean, if we think of the schemes that exist at the moment, they're predominantly in cities across the UK, and I think that kind of extends true if you look internationally as well. It's really cities that have been leading, and I think it's important as the UK looks at this that we continue to ensure that we allow that ecosystem for cities to drive forward, implement new policies, to try and seek particular transport outcomes to continue to exist. And that completely and entirely possible with the technologies that Alistair is referring to there, and a system that's centralized can also allow for cities like Birmingham, cities like Leeds to also explore different specific policies within their jurisdiction to help further shape that transport demand and encourage certain types of behaviors as well.
There's innovation from a sort of technological perspective, and the whole, how do you get a sort of nationally satellite-based system up and running with a really smooth customer interface? But there's also sort of innovation from a sort of policy perspective, right? So if you have an area of the country that you want to, say, level up, to use that term, you may well choose that it has a super low rate or zero rate of mobility pricing around it to encourage the business to relocate, industrial clusters, so on and so forth to form. So I think there's the wider sort of economic tool here that could be used, if the circumstances were right, to really sort of promote growth in target areas.
In terms of innovation overall, I mean, you kind of, in a way, Kyle, it's interesting. You kind of gave the game away a bit at the beginning, that the challenge has always been about palatability and getting a scheme together that's acceptable and implementable. And the challenge really hasn't been the technology side of that. Yes, the technology has evolved over the past number of decades in order to make it even simpler and more straightforward to look at things like satellite-based solutions and telematic-based solutions. But it's really about innovating in the policy space. And that's, I think, about thinking of all these things that Alistair has mentioned around thinking about what is the carrot, what's the incentive, how do you think more multimodally in terms of implementing road pricing, which is something I think that's a bit of a challenge for government. And I think it's encouraging to see government start to think about this, because it means thinking not just about the road network, but how is the road network functioning within a broader transport network that is ultimately multimodal.
That's really interesting. And I think another theme as well that came out of the Transport Committee's report was, and it's also mentioned in a lot of other places, is the need to keep this whole concept simple. And it never really sounds very simple, does it? Especially when you go into it. And I suppose if you're starting with a clean slate there, it'd be quite interesting to know from both of you, where would you start? What would be the first aim? If it was totally blank slate, what angle would you come at this from?
In terms of, you mean introducing a new system or designing or thinking about it? Or
I think probably the introduction of a system like this, where would you start? Obviously the technology is not an issue. Where would you be innovating in that policy space?
I mean, I think the absolute starting point is to have an honest discussion with the public about why it's coming about, because people watching this podcast will generally be interested in transport as a profession in some way or another, highways and transportation, and the wider public are simply uninformed, and the majority of people won't be aware, and nor should they necessarily, that there's 35 billion pounds each year that goes into most of which goes into the general coffers to pay for the NHS. So, that initial, how you broach that as a sort of initial conversation with the public is the starting point. Before you do anything, to gain some sort of level of understanding and acceptance. And just in the first instance, it's just about raising awareness. There's a tax here which is diminishing. The public finances are always under strain, but at the moment, probably a huge strain in terms of our ratio of debt to GDP. We're at almost unprecedented levels, or certainly for many, many decades. Most people do recognise there's a need somehow to make the public coffers balance, at least to a point, and it's not the time for necessarily removing a tax, albeit inadvertently. So that's the kind of the starting point. You kind of alluded there about it's got to be transparent, it's got to be simple for the public, and it absolutely has. So I think there's a sort of important differentiation between, what the public sees is absolute transparency. So if I want to go from A to B, I can quickly work out what that would cost, and it absolutely makes sense because it's at a certain time of day, and we certainly don't want to go down the road of other transport modes where the fee structure, the fare structure is unbelievably complicated and difficult to understand, and you can only travel on certain routes at certain times with certain tickets. But I think you can have that customer simplicity from a sort of information and transparency perspective, but under the hood, the sort of workings of it can actually be quite nuanced, so that certain zones are promoted in terms of where and when you'd like people to travel to manage the demand better. So there's a few kind of nuances, I think, in that area.
I think from my perspective, the other thing that I would add is I think for people like Alistair and myself and others in the industry that talk about this topic all the time, we all can very quickly fall into a trap of getting quite excited about it because it's an interesting policy space, and a number of people see the economic rationale and the opportunity that mobility pricing presents to, have a more appropriate form of taxation on the road that can also help to achieve some of those broader outcomes. But at the same time, I think it's really important that we think of this as a long-term transition and working towards a long-term transition in the way that we are changing taxation for individuals around the country, and that's no small change, and we shouldn't think of it that way by any means. And I think we help ourselves if we start thinking about a transition towards 2050, and when that fuel duty that we're looking to replace is really completely bottoming out, how are we slowly building something up at the same time to replace it, and getting people comfortable with that transition over a much longer period of time, rather than thinking that we need to have mobility pricing implemented by 2030. 2030. It might more be like, how do we work towards a system that looks complete by 2050?
I suppose it's on that point as well, is if this needs to be implemented at least in the short term, or that's what it's being alluded to, it needs to be implemented quite quickly. The sort of preparation for the next round of funding for the national highways, the road investment strategy 3 is opening this year. Is that something that road pricing or mobility pricing, should that really be embedded into kind of that, into the funding around it? And
I mean, that's a question for government really, Kyle, but I suspect, as Patrick alluded to, you've got quite a long tail on getting any national system implemented, and roads period 3 starts in 2025. That's far too soon for anything practical to be in operation. So I don't think it will affect anything in the over that timescale.
In both of your opinions, what's a realistic timescale for sort of like an implementation of a national strategy around mobility pricing?
Good question. I mean, I think sort of what Patrick was alluding to earlier was that these things often certainly take 10 years, a decade, probably longer in reality. And you've got to do it. You're much better doing something slowly and carefully than rushing into it and getting it wrong. So I think it's those kind of timescales that we're looking at. Interestingly, if you look at some of the places where it has landed well, if you look at the Stockholm example, the employed accord-based system around Stockholm, and polled the public before, and the general consensus was folk didn't want it. Calciprese, totally natural reaction. And then they trialled it for a period of time, and there's a lot of benefits, a lot of cars, a lot of unnecessary vehicles taken off the road, and other things put in place as well to help give people options. And then they polled people afterwards, and it was representative polled, or so we're led to believe. And the sense afterwards was that the public were in favour. So it's a really sort of interesting case study of sort of nudge theory of how public perception does change over time, and how people, if we can see the benefits of it, actually sort of voted that the trial continued. There's some interesting tools that any government may sort of consider to sort of gain acceptance in the longer term, and secondly get it right, get the policy right, because it's there are a lot of unknowns. It's a complex area. It's not easy to get it right first time. A lot of these schemes actually iterate, and it's those kind of fine tunes along a kind of period of time and you result in a successful system in terms of the outcomes, but it is with iteration as you go through it.
Ultimately, change requires trust, and building trust in the public in any new system will take both time, and it will also take significant effort on behalf of government and agencies working with government to help build up that trust among a stakeholder group. And I think that is, to Alistair's point, that's a conversation that shouldn't be rushed. And while ultimately a scheme might prove to be very simple for a user, from a user perspective, to understand and to interact with, there is a huge amount of policy nuance underneath that, and understanding implications for different groups within society, understanding implications on different marginalized communities. All of these things need to be properly considered and explored, and have open conversations with the public about that and how those things are being mitigated. Because I think, to the point about how challenging this is as a topic and this big change, we really have one opportunity to do this, and we need to get it right. And therefore, we shouldn't be rushing something through that might not be right and risks falling to pieces, and instead taking the time to get it right. And that requires a big, long national conversation.
And just on kind of Patrick's point there, this isn't specific or synonymous to the UK in any way. Every mobility pricing scheme, if you look at Australia, if you look at parts of the States, if you look at what's happening in the Netherlands at the moment, there's a national road user charging mobility pricing debate going on, starting with the heavier vehicles, the HGVs, and then considering other vehicles now. And it's a constant stop-start of a policy stopping, starting, getting kicked back, depends on the political consensus at the time. So if there's one thing, and when you look at schemes in the past in the UK, which have got to a similar point or even more advanced than the thinking today, under the Blair government and the Manchester congestion zone, it's littered with history is littered with kind of schemes that never really saw the light of day. So you need to think about it carefully. You can't rush into it. It's the absolute worst thing you can do. And of course, politically there needs to be some sort of consensus, really, because it's such a long term program that it'll typically in any country span several parliaments or whatever the equivalent is.
what you're both saying there, at least, is the technology is just not the issue at all, or how you implement it. It's the public engagement side, and obviously the policy issues that come with it, and they're the ones that are the biggest hurdles that need to be tackled. And that obviously won't be a quick process, it'll be a long drawn out one. But I suppose, how do you keep the momentum with that? If you're saying it's going to have to span several governments, where does the momentum or the drivers come from there?
Well, every government in the world is facing a similar challenge in terms of both carbon, the decarbonisation of their fleet in a response to the carbon challenge, and the change in revenues. So I think we're all realistic about the fact that as transport professional, we want good transport outcomes. But the prime reason for this is taxation receipts. That's the prime reason why it's being discussed again openly. It's a natural thing for any government to look to protect that tax receipt in one way or another. Quite how it will move forward in this country or in other countries will be fascinating to see, but it has got to be a government-led initiative by definition. It won't be we as professionals, as an industry, we can voice our views on things like we are doing today and talk about it in the round. Of course, it has to gain political traction, and of course at the moment there's a lot of other competing political. If you look in the UK, there's a lot of competing political issues, subjects of the day, which have a much higher, if you're in government, have got a much higher priority at the moment. So that'll be an interesting thing to see how it spins out.
I think what is important for those of us in the industry that see this as an opportunity and a conversation that at minimum needs to continue and should continue over the coming kind of decade. I think it's really important that road pricing gets connected and embedded in larger government policy, so that it's no longer seen as something that is a kind of standalone topic to be discussed. It's something that's seen as a tool to help deliver, the net zero ambition that we have as a country, to help deliver leveling up our other parts of the nation. So I think it's really important that we start connecting it to others. And that's something that we've seen in other parts of the world. In Ireland, for example, the National Clean Air Plan that was, Climate Action Plan that was released recently, in terms of how they're meeting their net zero ambitions, specifically mentions exploring road pricing as a tool to help achieve that ambition. So I think the more that we connect road pricing with a number of other macro policy ambitions of government, it creates a much greater sustaining power for that discussion that moves beyond whether or not road pricing should exist to how it should exist and how it should look, and how do we design a scheme that's most sensible for the long-term future.
So I suppose it seems now more than previously that this is a time that's realistic for road pricing or mobility pricing to be implemented based off of wider policy objectives like the decarbonisation of transport and everything. It'll definitely be an interesting one to see, and I thank you both for your time today, and it's a really interesting discussion there with lots of excellent points. And yeah, thanks again. So that was Alistair Hunter and Patrick Andison from Arup there on road pricing.
Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.